I should have known something was wrong when my nephew Jake stopped talking. Not just the usual teenage sullenness, complete silence, but I was too busy with my own life to notice until it was almost too late. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and this is the story of how I saved my sister's son from the man she thought would save their family. If you're reading this, please share it. Someone else might need to hear this story. It started on a humid Thursday evening in July when my sister Carmen called me sobbing. At first, I could barely understand her through the tears, but eventually the words came tumbling out between gasps for air. "He's gone, Becca. Jake just disappeared. Mark is out looking for him, but I'm so scared. What if something happened to him? What if he's hurt?" I dropped the stack of papers I'd been grading, summer school waits for no one, and grabbed my keys. "I'm coming over." "Have you called the police?" "Mark says we should wait, that Jake's just acting out because of the adjustment period. But Becca, he's only 14. He wouldn't just leave." 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway of Carmen's pristine suburban home. The house that was supposed to represent her fresh start after her divorce from Jake's father looked like something from a magazine spread. Perfect lawn, perfect landscaping, perfect everything. Too perfect. Mark's truck wasn't in the driveway, but I could see Carmen pacing behind the sheer curtains in the living room. She opened the door before I could knock, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her usually perfect hair disheveled. "Any word?" I asked, pulling her into a hug. She shook her head against my shoulder. "Mark's been driving around for 2 hours. He checked the park, the school, even the old neighborhood where Jake used to live with his dad." I held her at arm's length, studying her face. My sister had always been beautiful, but in the 6 months since she'd married Mark Davidson, something had changed. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, like she was constantly walking on eggshells. "Carmen, when did you last actually talk to Jake? Like, really talk to him?" Her face crumpled. "I don't know. Mark says teenage boys don't communicate much, that I shouldn't push. But you're right, he used to tell me everything. Ever since Mark moved in, it's like he's become a ghost in his own house." We spent the next hour calling Jake's friends, his father, anyone who might know where he'd gone. Each call led nowhere. His friends said he'd been distant lately, barely hanging out with them anymore. His father, my ex-brother-in-law Diego, was as worried as we were. "Carmen, I've been trying to get Jake to open up about what's going on at your house," Diego said when I talked to him. "Something's not right. He used to love spending time there, but lately he's been asking to stay here more often. When I asked him why, he just shrugged and said it was easier." "Easier than what?" "That's what I asked. But you know Jake, when he shuts down, that's it." Just after 10 p.m., Mark's truck pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as my sister's husband climbed out, his jaw set in frustration. Mark Davidson was what most people would call handsome, tall, athletic, with the kind of confidence that filled a room. He was a successful contractor, owned his own company, and had swept Carmen off her feet when she was at her most vulnerable. But as he walked toward the house, something about his body language made my skin crawl. There was an anger in his movement, a barely controlled violence that I'd noticed before, but dismissed as concern for his new family. The door opened with more force than necessary. "Any word?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Nothing," Carmen said, immediately shrinking into herself. "Did you check?" "I checked everywhere." His voice was sharp, cutting. "The kid's being dramatic. He'll come home when he gets hungry." I stood up from the couch, unable to keep quiet any longer. "Mark, he's 14 years old. He's been gone for hours. Maybe we should call the police." Mark's eyes narrowed as they focused on me. "Rebecca, I didn't know you were here." There was something in the way he said my name that made me understand why Jake might have run. It wasn't just dismissive, it was hostile. "I'm here because my nephew is missing and my sister is worried sick." "Your nephew," Mark repeated slowly, "is my stepson, and I know what's best for him. The police will just file a report and tell us the same thing I'm telling you. Teenage boys run off when they don't get their way. He'll be back." "What didn't he get his way about?" I asked. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen looked between us like she was watching a tennis match, her hands wringing in her lap. Finally, Mark shrugged. "Kids his age think they should be able to do whatever they want. Jake's learning that's not how the real world works." Before I could respond, we heard a sound at the front door. Carmen jumped up and ran to open it, and there was Jake, soaked from the rain that had started while we weren't paying attention. His dark hair was plastered to his head, his clothes muddy and torn. "Jake!" Carmen rushed to him, but he stepped back before she could embrace him. "I'm fine," he said quietly, his eyes not meeting any of ours. "I'm going to my room." "Oh no, you're not!" Mark's voice boomed through the entryway. "You're going to explain where you've been and why you thought it was okay to worry your mother like this." Jake's shoulders tensed. For a moment I thought he might actually speak up, fight back. Instead, he just nodded and mumbled, "Sorry." "Sorry doesn't cut it," Mark continued, moving closer to Jake. "You're grounded for a month. No phone, no friends, no leaving this house except for school." "Mark," Carmen said softly, "maybe we should just—" "Carmen." The way Mark said her name made her immediately fall silent. Jake needs to learn that actions have consequences. I watched this interaction with growing alarm. The way Mark commanded the room, the way Carmen immediately deferred to him, the way Jake seemed to shrink in on himself. It all painted a picture I didn't like. "Jake," I said, stepping forward, "are you okay? You look like you've been through hell." For just a second, Jake's eyes met mine, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. Fear. Not the normal fear a kid might have of getting in trouble, but something deeper. Something that spoke of constant vigilance, of walking through a minefield every day. "He's fine," Mark answered for him. "Just wet and dirty from whatever stunt he pulled tonight. Go shower and get to bed. We'll talk more about this tomorrow." Jake nodded and started toward the stairs, but not before I saw him glance back at his mother with an expression that broke my heart. It was a look of resignation, of someone who had given up hope of being saved. As Jake's footsteps faded upstairs, Mark turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming over, Rebecca. But everything's under control now. Family matters, you know." The dismissal was clear. Carmen walked me to the door, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, gratitude that Jake was safe, but also something else. Disappointment? Shame? "Carmen," I said quietly, "call me tomorrow, okay? Maybe Jake and I could grab lunch or something, just to talk." Before she could answer, Mark appeared behind her. "That's probably not a good idea. Jake needs to focus on his responsibilities at home. Too many outside influences just confuse things for kids his age." I looked past him to my sister, willing her to stand up for her son, for herself. But Carmen just nodded. "Maybe in a few weeks when things settle down." I drove home that night with a sick feeling in my stomach. Something was very wrong in that house, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Mark's behavior was controlling, sure, but was it abusive? Was I overreacting because I'd never really liked him? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in Jake's eyes. I'd been a teacher for 15 years, and I knew the signs of a kid in trouble. So I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick and drove to Jake's school. Lincoln Middle School was buzzing with summer school activity when I arrived. I knew the principal, Mrs. Henderson, from various education conferences, so getting a few minutes with her wasn't difficult. "I'm concerned about my nephew, Jake Torres," I told her. "Has he had any behavioral issues lately? Any changes you've noticed?" Mrs. Henderson's expression grew serious. "Actually, yes. Jake used to be one of our brightest students, very social, involved in several clubs. But this year, especially since the spring, he's become withdrawn. His grades have dropped, and his teachers say he seems tired all the time. Has anyone talked to his parents?" We called for a conference in May. His stepfather came in, nice man, very concerned. He explained that Jake was having trouble adjusting to the new family situation, that they were working with him at home on his behavior. My heart sank. What kind of behavior issues? According to Mr. Davidson, Jake had been acting out, being disrespectful, not following rules, typical adjustment problems. He assured us they had it under control. I left the school feeling more unsettled than before. Everything Mark had told them sounded reasonable on the surface, but combined with what I'd observed, it painted a different picture. That afternoon, I positioned myself at a coffee shop across from Jake's school, waiting for dismissal. When Jake emerged, walking alone with his head down, I intercepted him. "Hey, Jake, want to grab a smoothie?" He looked around nervously. "I'm supposed to go straight home. It'll be quick. Just 5 minutes, I promise." In the smoothie shop, Jake sat across from me, barely touching his drink. He looked older than his 14 years, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Are you okay at home?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "It's fine." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you're okay." Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his cup. "Mark says I need to adjust better, that I'm making things hard for Mom." "What kind of things?" "I don't know. Everything I do is wrong. If I'm too loud, if I'm too quiet, if I eat too fast, if I don't eat enough. Mom used to stick up for me, but now she just tells me to listen to Mark." My heart was breaking for this kid. "Jake, where did you go last night?" "I was just walking." I needed to think. He looked up at me with those same scared eyes I'd seen the night before. "Aunt Becca, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you think there's something wrong with me?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What? Jake, no. Why would you think that?" "Mark says I have problems, that I'm damaged because of the divorce, because Dad wasn't around enough. He says Mom doesn't see it because she feels guilty, but that he can help fix me if I just cooperate." I had to take a deep breath to keep my voice steady. "Jake, you are not damaged. You're a good kid going through a tough situation. What does Mark mean by cooperate?" Jake's phone buzzed, and he looked at it with panic. "I have to go. I'm already late." "Jake, wait." But he was already heading for the door. "Thanks for the smoothie, Aunt Becca. But please don't tell anyone we talked, okay? It'll just make things worse." I sat in that smoothie shop for another hour, trying to process what Jake had told me. Mark wasn't just controlling, he was systematically breaking down a 14-year-old boy's sense of self-worth. And my sister was either too blind or too scared to see it. That evening I called Carmen, but Mark answered the phone. "She's busy right now," he said curtly. "And before you ask, Jake's fine. He's in his room doing homework. I'd like to talk to him." "That's not going to happen. Jake needs to focus on his responsibilities without distractions." The line went dead. I spent the weekend researching emotional abuse in blended families, psychological manipulation tactics, anything that might help me understand what was happening. What I found made my blood run cold. Mark's behavior fit a pattern called coercive control, a systematic method of isolating and dominating family members. The victim is made to feel like everything is their fault, that they need to be fixed, while the abuser presents themselves as the reasonable authority figure just trying to help. By Monday, I'd made a decision. I was going to document everything and build a case, just like any good teacher preparing a lesson plan. But first, I needed to talk to Diego. Jake's father met me at a diner near his work, his face etched with worry. "Rebecca, I'm glad you called. I've been trying to get Jake to open up, but he barely talks anymore. When he does come to stay with me, he seems afraid to relax, like he's constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Diego, I think Mark is abusing Jake. Not physically, but psychologically." Diego's face darkened. "I've suspected something like that. But Jake won't talk, and Carmen," he shook his head. "She's changed. She used to be so strong, so protective of Jake. Now she defers to Mark on everything. We need to help them, both of them." "How?" "Carmen's made it clear that Mark is her priority now. And legally, since she has primary custody, there's not much I can do unless I can prove abuse. Then that's what we need to do." Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective. I documented every interaction I had with Jake, every conversation with Carmen where Mark controlled or cut short our time together. I researched Mark's background and discovered some interesting information. His first marriage had ended when his wife left with their daughter, claiming he was controlling and emotionally abusive. I also started showing up at places where I might accidentally run into Jake: the library, the park near his school, the grocery store. Each time, I could see the fear in his eyes when he realized he'd have to explain our encounter to Mark. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after Jake's disappearance, when I found him sitting alone on a bench outside the public library crying. "Jake, what's wrong?" He looked up at me with such desperation that I immediately sat down beside him. "I can't do it anymore, Aunt Becca. I can't be what he wants me to be." "What happened?" "Last night at dinner, I laughed at something on TV. Mark said I was being disruptive and disrespectful. He made me sit at the table for 2 hours after everyone else was done, thinking about how my behavior affects the family." Jake wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Then this morning, I spilled orange juice on the counter, and he said it was another example of how I don't care about anyone but myself." "Jake, that's not normal. Kids spill things, kids laugh at TV shows. That's what kids do." That's what I thought. But Mark says I need to grow up, that I'm too old to act like a child. He says if I really loved Mom, I'd try harder to be the kind of son that makes her proud instead of embarrassing her all the time. I felt rage building in my chest. Jake, look at me. You are not embarrassing anyone. You're a 14-year-old boy, and you're supposed to laugh and spill things and be a kid. Mark is wrong, but Mom agrees with him. She told me yesterday that Mark just wants what's best for me, that I need to listen to him because he knows about raising children. That was it. I couldn't let this continue another day. Jake, I want you to come stay with me for a few days. His eyes widened. I can't. Mark would never allow it. And Mom, he trailed off. Let me worry about Mark and your mom. You just need to know that you have a safe place to go, okay? That afternoon, I drove to Carmen's house and knocked on the door. Mark answered, as I'd expected he would. Rebecca, what are you doing here? I'm here to talk to my sister about Jake spending a few days with me. That's not going to happen. Jake has responsibilities here, and running away to his aunt's house every time things get tough isn't going to teach him anything. I'd like to hear that from Carmen. Mark's jaw tightened. Carmen and I make decisions together about Jake, and we've decided that what he needs is consistency and structure, not to be coddled by relatives who feel sorry for him. Feel sorry for him? Mark, I love him. He's my nephew. He's my stepson, and he's my responsibility now. Carmen appreciates that I'm willing to step up and be the father figure Jake needs, even when it's difficult. Behind Mark, I could see Carmen hovering in the hallway, listening but not approaching. She looked smaller than ever, almost fragile. Carmen, I called out, can we talk? She started to move toward us, but Mark held up a hand without turning around. Carmen's busy right now. Like I said, we make decisions together, and we've already decided about Jake. I want to hear it from her. Mark stepped closer to me, and for the first time, I understood the intimidation Jake must feel every day. Mark was a big man, and he used his size to make his point. Rebecca, I'm going to say this once, and I hope you'll listen. Your interference in our family is not helping Jake. In fact, it's making things worse. Every time you fill his head with the idea that he can run away from his problems, you're undermining the progress we're making with him. What progress? The kid is miserable. The kid is learning discipline and responsibility, things his father clearly never taught him. The insult to Diego was the last straw. Mark, you don't know the first thing about Jake or what kind of father Diego is. What I see is a man who's systematically tearing down a 14-year-old's self-esteem and calling it parenting. Mark's face went red. I think you need to leave now. Not until I talk to Carmen. Carmen! Mark barked, never taking his eyes off me. Come tell your sister that we have everything under control here. Carmen appeared beside Mark like a ghost, her hands twisting together nervously. Becca, Mark's right. Jake is doing better with the structure. You taking him away would just set back his progress. Carmen, does Jake seem happy to you? She glanced quickly at Mark before answering. Happiness isn't the goal right now. Jake needs to learn respect and responsibility. Once he does that, he'll be happier. It was Mark's words coming out of my sister's mouth, and it made me sick. Carmen, can I talk to you privately for just a minute? Anything you need to say to Carmen, you can say in front of me, Mark said. We don't have secrets in this family. That's when I realized how completely Mark had isolated both Jake and Carmen. They weren't allowed private conversations, private thoughts, private relationships. Everything went through Mark. Fine, I said. Carmen, I love you and I love Jake. But what's happening in this house isn't normal, and it isn't healthy. Mark is controlling both of you, and Jake is suffering because of it. Carmen's face crumpled, but Mark immediately put his arm around her shoulders. See what I mean, honey? This is exactly the kind of interference we talked about. Rebecca doesn't understand our situation, and she's trying to undermine our family. I'm trying to save our family, I shot back. By breaking it up? By turning Jake against me? By making Carmen doubt the progress we've made? I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw a woman who was drowning, but had been convinced that the anchor around her neck was keeping her afloat. Carmen, when was the last time you made a decision about Jake without asking Mark first? She opened her mouth, then closed it, confusion flickering across her face. When was the last time Jake hugged you? When was the last time he told you about his day at school? When was the last time you saw him genuinely smile? Tears started streaming down Carmen's face, but Mark's grip on her shoulder tightened. Rebecca, you're upsetting your sister with these manipulative questions. I think it's time for you to go. But I could see that something had shifted in Carmen's expression. For just a moment, the fog had cleared, and she was seeing what I was seeing. Mark, Carmen said quietly, maybe Jake could spend one night with Becca, just to give us all a break. Mark's head snapped toward her. Carmen, we talked about this. Consistency is key. If Jake thinks he can run to his aunt every time things get difficult. One night, Carmen said, her voice a little stronger. Just one night. I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen. Mark was clearly struggling to maintain control while not seeming unreasonable in front of me. Finally, he nodded curtly. One night, but Jake needs to understand that this isn't a reward for his behavior. It's a privilege that can be taken away if he doesn't show proper appreciation. It was a small victory, but it was something. An hour later, Jake was in my car with a small overnight bag, looking like he'd been granted a reprieve from death row. As we drove away from the house, I could see him gradually relaxing, his shoulders dropping, his breathing becoming less shallow. Jake, we need to talk about what's been happening at home. He was quiet for a moment. Then in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it, he said, I know it's not normal, but Mom seems happier with Mark than she ever was with Dad. And Mark says, if I just try harder, if I stop being so selfish, we could be a real family. Jake, you're not selfish. You're 14. You're supposed to be focused on yourself sometimes. That's how you figure out who you are. Mark says that's exactly the kind of thinking that creates entitled adults who never learn to consider others. Hearing Mark's words coming out of Jake's mouth made me want to turn around and confront that man again. Instead, I focused on the road ahead. Jake, what would you say if I told you that I've talked to your principal and she says you used to be one of the happiest, most engaged students at school? He looked genuinely surprised. She said that? She did. She's worried about the changes she's seen in you this year. Mark says the teachers don't understand because they're not around for the real behavioral problems. He says they only see the public face I put on at school. What if Mark is wrong? What if the teachers see the real you, and what Mark sees is a kid who's being systematically broken down? Jake stared out the window for a long time. Finally, he said, I've thought about that. But if Mark is wrong, that means Mom chose someone who's hurting me. And I can't believe that about Mom. That night, Jake and I stayed up late talking. Really talking, for the first time in months. I learned about the daily critiques of his behavior. The way Mark had convinced Carmen that Jake needed firm guidance to overcome his behavioral issues. The way every natural impulse Jake had was labeled as defiance or selfishness. The worst part, Jake said, is that I've started to believe him. I catch myself thinking that maybe I am too loud, too messy, too childish. Maybe I am making Mom's life harder. Jake, listen to me. You are not too anything. You are exactly who you're supposed to be at 14 years old. And anyone who tries to convince you otherwise is wrong. The next morning, I made Jake his favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes with whipped cream. As he ate, actually enjoying his food for the first time I'd seen in months, I made a decision. Jake, what if you didn't have to go back? He looked up from his plate, hope and fear warring in his expression. What do you mean? I mean, what if you could live with your dad, or with me? What if you could be a regular kid again? Mom would never let that happen. And Mark would say I'm running away from my problems instead of facing them. Jake, you're not the one with the problem. Mark is the problem. That afternoon, I called Diego and asked him to meet us at my house. When he arrived, Jake ran to him like he hadn't seen him in years, even though it had only been a week. Dad, can I come live with you? Diego looked over Jake's head at me, questions in his eyes. We need to talk, I said. The three of us spent the next 2 hours going through everything that had been happening. Diego recorded Jake's testimony on his phone, documenting the emotional abuse, the systematic destruction of Jake's self-confidence, the way Mark had isolated him from his support system. I should have fought harder for custody, Diego said, his voice thick with guilt. I thought Jake needed stability, that Carmen could provide things I couldn't. It's not too late, I said. But we need to be strategic about this. The first step was getting Jake into counseling with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. The second was documenting everything Mark had done, building a case that would hold up in family court. But I knew that as soon as Mark realized Jake wasn't coming back willingly, he would escalate his control tactics. And the person who would suffer most would be Carmen. I was right. When I called Carmen to tell her that Jake needed a few more days with me to work through some things, Mark got on the phone. "Rebecca, you're kidnapping my stepson. I'm giving my nephew a safe place to stay while we figure out what's best for him. What's best for him is to come home and face his responsibilities like a man instead of running away like a child." Mark, Jake is a child. He's 14 years old. He's old enough to understand consequences. And the consequence of this stunt is that he's lost the privilege of visiting relatives who undermine his progress. You can't keep him away from his family. Watch me. The line went dead. Over the next week, I tried repeatedly to reach Carmen, but Mark always answered the phone. He told me Carmen was disappointed in Jake's behavior and didn't want to talk until Jake was ready to apologize and come home. But I knew my sister better than that, so I decided to take a more direct approach. I showed up at Carmen's work. She was a nurse at the local hospital and waited in the parking lot until her shift ended. When she came out, she looked exhausted and defeated. "Becca, what are you doing here? We need to talk." Carmen looked around nervously, like Mark might appear at any moment. "I can't. Mark is picking me up." "Carmen, Jake isn't coming home." She stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's staying with Diego, permanently. We're going to court to change the custody arrangement." Carmen's face went white. "You can't do that. Jake belongs with me. I'm his mother." "Then act like it," I said, more harshly than I'd intended. "Carmen, when was the last time you put Jake's needs before Mark's wants?" She started crying right there in the hospital parking lot. "You don't understand, Becca. Mark saved us. After the divorce, I was falling apart. I couldn't handle Jake on my own, and Mark stepped in. He brought stability and structure to our lives. He brought control and manipulation. Carmen, look at yourself. Look at what you've become. You used to be strong, independent, fierce when it came to protecting Jake. Now you can't even have a conversation with your sister without Mark's permission." "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you made a decision about anything without asking Mark first? When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" Carmen was sobbing now. "You don't understand how hard it is to be a single mother. Mark took care of everything. He made life easier." "At what cost, Carmen? Your son is miserable. You're miserable. The only person who benefits from this arrangement is Mark." Just then, Mark's truck pulled into the parking lot. Carmen immediately straightened up, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. "Please don't say anything to him," she whispered. But Mark took one look at Carmen's red eyes and my presence and knew exactly what was happening. "Rebecca," his voice was ice cold, "I thought we agreed you were going to stay out of our family business." "Jake is my family too. Jake is a minor child who belongs with his mother and me. This kidnapping stunt ends now. It's not kidnapping when a child goes to live with his father to escape an abusive situation." Mark's face went red. "Abusive? I've never laid a hand on that kid. There's more than one way to abuse a child, Mark. Emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, systematic destruction of a child's self-worth. That's all abuse. You have no idea what you're talking about. Jake was a spoiled, undisciplined brat when I met him. I've spent 2 years trying to turn him into a decent human being, and you want to undo all that progress because you think children should be allowed to do whatever they want." Carmen stood between us, looking back and forth like she was watching a tennis match. "Carmen," I said, ignoring Mark, "you have to choose. Your son or your husband. Because right now you can't have both." Mark immediately put his arm around Carmen possessively. "Carmen doesn't have to choose anything. Jake is going to learn that running away doesn't solve problems. When he's ready to come home and apologize, we'll consider taking him back." "Consider taking him back?" The words exploded out of me. "He's her son. He's a 14-year-old who thinks he can manipulate adults into giving him his way. Well, he's about to learn that real life doesn't work like that." I looked at my sister one more time. "Carmen, if you don't fight for Jake now, you're going to lose him forever. And eventually, when Mark gets tired of controlling you, you're going to be alone." Carmen opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but Mark guided her firmly toward his truck. "Come on, honey. Rebecca's just trying to upset you." I stood in that parking lot and watched my sister drive away with the man who was destroying her family, and I knew that I might have saved Jake, but I'd lost Carmen. The custody hearing took place 6 weeks later. Diego had hired a good lawyer, and we had documentation of everything: Jake's testimony, records from his school showing the dramatic change in his behavior and academic performance, even testimony from other parents who had noticed Jake's transformation from a happy, outgoing kid to a withdrawn, anxious shell of himself. Mark and Carmen arrived with their own lawyer and a folder full of character witnesses who testified to Mark's patience and dedication in trying to help a troubled child. They painted Jake as a manipulative boy who played his parents against each other and used emotional blackmail to get his way. But when Jake testified, speaking clearly and calmly about the daily critiques of his behavior, the impossible standards he was expected to meet, the way he'd been made to feel like everything wrong in the family was his fault, the judge's expression grew increasingly serious. "Your Honor," Mark's lawyer argued, "this is simply a case of a teenager who doesn't want to follow rules and is using emotional manipulation to avoid responsibility." "Counselor," the judge replied, "I've been hearing family cases for 15 years. What I'm hearing from this child is not manipulation. It's a cry for help." The judge awarded primary custody to Diego, with Carmen receiving supervised visitation until she completed family counseling and could demonstrate that she was capable of prioritizing Jake's well-being over her husband's demands. Carmen didn't speak to me for 6 months after the hearing, but Jake thrived. Within weeks of living with his father, he was laughing again, bringing friends home, participating in activities he'd been forced to give up. His grades improved, his teachers commented on how much happier he seemed, and most importantly, he started believing in himself again. The breakthrough with Carmen came on Jake's 15th birthday. Diego had organized a small party, and Jake had specifically asked that his mother be invited, despite everything that had happened. Carmen showed up alone. "Where's Mark?" I asked, not because I wanted him there, but because I was surprised he'd let Carmen come by herself. "We're getting divorced," Carmen said quietly. "I've moved back into my old apartment." Jake overheard and came running over. "Mom, is that true?" Carmen nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry for everything. You were right, Aunt Becca. I chose the wrong person, and I almost lost the most important person in my life." Jake hugged his mother like he hadn't seen her in years. "You're here now," he said. "That's what matters." It took time for Carmen to rebuild her relationship with Jake. Months of family counseling, countless conversations about boundaries and healthy relationships, and a lot of work to undo the damage that had been done. But they got there. Jake is 17 now, a senior in high school planning for college. He's confident, funny, kind, and everything a 17-year-old should be. He has friends, hobbies, dreams for the future, and most importantly, he knows he's loved unconditionally by the people who matter. Carmen is stronger now than she ever was before. She learned to recognize the warning signs of controlling behavior, to trust her instinct.